Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm Adam Kleinman, co-curator of the exhibition, which I hope you had a chance to see before entering. We're going to get into it a little bit, and in case you didn't, the exhibition will be open after the talk. I wanted to invite you not only to this talk and also to see the exhibition, but to do something very special. Like all exhibitions, there are unique moments in which various hearts and minds come together to perform something special. And there are many people in the back of the house that should be acknowledged, particularly the team here at REDCAT and my home institution KADIST, as well as partners at LACMA, and many, many, many people from installers to printers to friends and family that contributed ideas and information. So if we could take a moment to acknowledge them, that's my third invitation. And just a little housekeeping so you know, I'll wrap up pretty quickly. We'll do a talk for about 40 minutes with our guests, and then we'll have time for a pretty healthy Q&A. So to jump into it, I'd like to introduce Ayana Jamieson, who is the co-founder of the Octavia E. Butler Legacy Network, and of course, American artist who is the artist on show in the exhibition. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you all for coming. I'm hoping that this talk can sort of get into some of the deep context for what it is Octavia Butler was doing, what it is we've been doing in our own conversations in our work. And the reason I wanted to speak to you, Ayana, is because your work has been so phenomenal and like inspiring to me, and knowing like you were the one person I definitely had to meet when I was working on this project. So yeah, I'm glad that that was able to happen. And I'll just briefly give a little context about what I was trying to do with this project, and this is sort of an ongoing thing, Shaper of God, and that's to like not only think about Butler's work and her writing, but also who she was, how she lived her life, what her relationship was to Pasadena and Altadena in California, thinking about the threads of migration that led to her family being here, how that coincides with our own family histories. So just trying to think about a sort of overarching context for who she was and how she came to be and how that also folds into her writing. And I thought maybe we could start by talking about her relationship to her mother and how her mother ended up here, and maybe you could say something about that and we can just sort of go from there.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Adam, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I love having this as part of my life's work, which is talking about a person who I admire, but not as a person who's just a literary or cultural figure, but as a real person. And I think that's one of the reasons why I agreed to collaborate and talk with American about the work that they were developing, is because what you may not know is both of us sort of grew up in Pasadena. We both have divorced parents, which is not related necessarily, but that we spent time in the same places and spaces that Octavia E. Butler inhabited. So when we think about the history of her family and really the waves of the Great Migration and Black folks in California, we should know, if you don't know, Octavia E. Butler was named for her mother and her grandmother. Her name was Octavia Estelle Butler. Her mother's name was Octavia Margaret Butler. And so I will just say OMB because that makes it easier in reference, because I'm going to talk about both of them in relationship. Her grandmother's name was Estella Guy, and they called her Stella. And Octavia was named after her grandmother. And when she was in school, all the way up until the time when she was in Clarion, people who were her friends outside of home and her teachers and on her report cards, they referred to her as Estella Butler. So really, her email was something like *8 something, right? So we see that she really felt that her name was important, and then started publishing under her own name. So her family migrated from Louisiana on a sugar plantation in about 1930. There were 6 or 7 kids, and Estella and 2 of the older kids stayed in Louisiana, and then Octavia Margaret Butler, who was about 18 years old, came with the younger siblings to Los Angeles to live and work after having only 3 years of education. So they plopped her in school at the time when they thought her chronological age was, but she had been working for people in order to go to school. She worked for a family, went to school, and then came home and did more chores. So she's living this life, Octavia E. Butler's living this life, having gone all the way through high school in Pasadena that her mother could only dream of. And I think that's a great place to start for us to think about who she was and where they came from, and how when people say like, oh, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, like we're really like two Black kids from the suburbs who have achieved some things that are, you know, people like Octavia E. Butler's mother, who was a domestic her whole life, only, you know, dreamed of. It might as well have been science fiction.
Yeah, and I think that's what was so impressive to me, thinking about how Octavia Estelle Butler manifested her dreams into reality and wrote them down persistently, and thinking about the conditions that she grew up in, and thinking of her creative writing practice as a positive obsession, as she called it, and something that, you know, motivated her even when she was working these like really whack jobs, day jobs. She would, you know, come home at night and work on her writing, and I think that is really inspiring for me, thinking about what it was like for me, you know, in high school and stuff, thinking about myself as like an artist, and wanting to find some sort of motivation for what that could look like later on. But I wanted to touch on what you were saying about the naming, because what you'll see in the show is like the pieces on the wall are these transcriptions from documents in the archives, and they're sort of, you know, traced to look exactly like the original documents, but they're on the paper that you take notes on if you visit her archives at the Huntington Library. So all of her papers and things are donated to the Huntington Library, and you can visit them, but you only have these pink paper sheets. But if you look at those, you'll see, you know, like she signed the cover of her notebook for school, Estella, and you'll see, you know, the reference to her mother. There's a letter from her mother where she talks about growing up in Louisiana, you know, and not having paved roads, not having transportation, and so wanting to place that alongside this like bus map that Octavia carried, because she always took the bus, and sort of seeing that transition, I think, where you're talking about like being your ancestors' wildest dreams, you know, like her mother didn't have much, but she's sort of able to accomplish some things over time, and so just trying to draw that connection.
I think people don't realize that it's not just Octavia Butler, but it's like many, many people who are famous. They're often women and aunties and women in the neighborhood who are doing things that are lifting people up. I feel like when she went to Clarion, for example, her mother had saved up $600 that she gave her that she could use toward the tuition because she had gotten a scholarship. $600 when you're making $40 a month cleaning some wealthy person's house. Like how long, how many months, how many years did it take her to accumulate that $600? And she told her daughter, I need this money back. I'm going to use this for my teeth, right? It was like her dental money in lieu of insurance. But I feel like those things are really important. They're as important as the parable of the sower. So I think, you know, I've been doing this for a long time, and I didn't see the things that American was going to select. Today is the first day that I've seen the exhibit. I heard that it was going to be the wall, but it's thinking about how timely those images are and the barriers that these folks faced, even in California, which has more Jim Crow laws on the books than any other state in the whole country. So thinking about the wall being indoors at Cal Arts and the gate being open, I'm still processing what that means and how those items were selected, because I didn't see them, right? And if you look at the handwriting, you see how much education people had. They could write in cursive, though, even though they didn't have a lot of formal education. And this is not even something that they're teaching in schools consistently now. So I think we have to take a step back and consider the enormity of what it means that her papers are the most widely used and most popular papers at the Huntington Library. And her mother literally cleaned houses up the street from the Huntington. Like literally, you could almost walk to them. This is how far she's come. She wanted her daughter to have a job inside where she could sit down. She wanted her to be a secretary or a typist or something. Can you tell me, like, what kind of, I just wonder, what kind of things did your parents want you to be? Like, when did you tell them you were going to be an artist? Because I'm always curious for myself.
I don't know what they expected me to be. They were pretty encouraging of what I wanted to do. I think there was a time in my life when I thought about being an engineer. And I think that relates to also how I've thought about this landscape informing Butler and myself, you know, growing up in Pasadena, where you have like Caltech and JPL as these sort of like looming institutions that I think like inform the culture and maybe a sort of idea of aspiration for what you can do. There's, you know, this sort of like collegiate vibe within the city, I think. And so I think at one point, like, I thought about being an engineer, like, what if I could go to Caltech? And then I was like, no, I think I'll be bored. Like, I need to do something else. But yeah.
But you did go to a school that has a top engineering program.
Yeah, that's true.
So
I went to Cal Poly Pomona, where
I also went, where I'm also
yeah.
a professor.
Yeah.
Where my grandmother also went and earned 2 bachelor's degrees after being a nurse. So I feel like there's something about public education that comes up in her writing. There is an image in the exhibit that is the front of, is it the middle school?
It's a junior high school notebook, but then she crosses it out and then she writes John Muir High School, then she crosses that out and she writes PCC. So I think she had that with her through that time. I don't know how it survived that long, but I think that was the reference.
So this is a person, a regular person who went to regular schools that didn't have special tutors. She didn't have AP classes. She didn't have all of the things that supposedly make one successful.
Right. Well, I think similarly about her relationship to public transportation, because she always took the bus or someone would drive her around. And that's something that felt very important for me in thinking about how she understood the landscape and the geography, and like writing about, you know, what LA was like, and, you know, taking the bus to the LA Public Library to do her writing. And that's kind of where these bus stop signs factor in, because, you know, it's a reference to her thinking about the landscape through the bus stop. And so these are bus stops that she would have sat at, but they, you know, look how they would have looked like in the 60s when she was going to high school, in the 80s when she was working on Parable of the Sower. So sort of looking into this history of the LA landscape and just trying to like fold that into the present.
Yes, and some people here are probably not old enough to remember when RTD buses were the norm. Now we have this blue logo with the Metro. But when we were growing up here, it was like RTD, and we affectionately called it Richard T. Davis was like giving us a ride to where we're going. So I think she was with people, like, you know, side by side, thigh to thigh, sharing space. And then later when she writes, all that you touch, you change. It's not like she's doing it in a philosophical way. It's because, like, literally the people are within reach of you, which is something we haven't had for the last couple of years. Can you tell me?
What I want to touch on that, because that reminded me of my aunt and how she kind of factors into this, because basically I asked my aunt to narrate this video that's in the show, and the reason for that is because she was at John Muir High School at the same time as Octavia Butler, and I had talked to her once and mentioned the project, and then she was like, oh yeah, I remember Octavia, and she kind of described her. They weren't like very close, but she, you know, remembers her. And when you mentioned that about the bus, I think she had described like being on the bus at the same time or something. But thinking about how to include Octavia within this like broader image of, you know, being a Black woman at that point in time within Pasadena or Los Angeles. And so trying to think about, you know, my aunt as also being in a similar position in some ways. So sort of tapping into the network, you know, of many other people at a similar age, similar location, you know, that may have had a parallel experience, and sort of using that to, I think, I guess, like, add more depth to how we understand, you know, Butler's life.
I think that's what most people who are doing work on her miss, which is what I love about your work and your ideas. Even thinking about migration patterns, people think like she just popped up fully formed, like Athena from Zeus's brain or something. But there were all these other regular folks doing things, and I feel like we can say her name. Americans' auntie is named Gail, and I call her Auntie Gail out of respect. But it's her voice that you hear on the video in the exhibition. And thinking about the wisdom that is contained in the lived experiences of people who, you know, chronologically may not be with us for very much longer. This is a theme that comes up that people sort of miss. They want to say like, oh, she was a genius, but what about the organic intellectual impact of like regular folks living in the neighborhood? I think Auntie Gail says she went to middle school with her as well at Washington.
Okay. You knew that, I didn't know that.
I spent Mother's Day Eve with Auntie Gail's book club, and someone was celebrating their 81st birthday while we were there, and we were discussing kindred. So I got a different sort of, it was all women, and these women get together and, you know, read together, and they were so proud of you and just so enamored with this process. I sensed that they felt that you were bringing them and the importance of who they were into your work, even when they're not necessarily represented in it. I feel that was the sentiment. I don't know what you think.
It is that 100%. I mean, I'm glad that they feel that. I want to talk about the wall because you mentioned it earlier, and I wanted to say that, like, when I was thinking about what this looks like obviously I'm drawing on a lot of the imagery of what walls look like throughout Los Angeles, you know, the highway wall, the community wall, all of these various types of walls, and trying to make something that like doesn't look spectacular, even though it's, you know, in the middle of a gallery and it veers towards that, but thinking about it as something that's somewhat mundane, but then like when she writes about the wall, like even in this note she has where she's like, in the 2020s, she describes, you know, LA has even more walls than it does now, you know, because that was something already present. And yeah, maybe we talked a little bit earlier, but maybe you could say about what the sort of political landscape was at the time that she was working on Parable of the Sower and sort of making these predictions.
So we have to go into the way, way back machine of the 1980s for this. But I had to go back and look at my notes. Adam American and I have this shared document that we've been collaborating on, thinking about what we wanted to share. So two things are going on. One thing is that there's this novel that was never published called Blindsight that has, one of the things in it is contagious empathy. So that ends up getting put into Parable of the Sower. But the landscape, we know that Parable of the Sower was inspired by Proposition 187, which was a constitutional amendment, much like the Defense of Marriage Act, that the majority of the voting population voted for, not necessarily the population of people overall. And so we had some very, when she was growing up, Ronald Reagan was governor of California. Then eventually, this is the 1960s, like, so when she's in high school and graduating, they're waiting for the passage of the civil rights amendments during this time. And in California, there were a lot of things happening. We think of ourselves as being liberal and open, but really there were, you know, we had Governor Duke Majan and we had Pete Wilson, and this is the time when Prop 187 gets put on the ballot because the legislature would not pass it. And it was eventually ruled unconstitutional. But we had, you know, the riots happened after she'd already sent the book to press, but the perfect storm for creating this what would we call it? It's civil disobedience in this like uprising, much like we're seeing now. Today is the anniversary of the Tulsa riots. Today is also 2 years since George Floyd was murdered in public, lynched in public. So these kinds of things, we're seeing them and experiencing them now, but they were happening and being percolated at the time when the book was being written. Also corrupt police officers, all kinds of things were happening during this time that she was witnessing. Oil spills, climate change. There was a recession in the 1980s, and here we are again.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think, she's taking what she's seeing and sort of exacerbating it, or even just describing it, and it's sort of, coming back to that. Maybe it never fully went away from that. But I was also thinking about, at the time that she was graduating high school, was the Watts riots. And also, like, one thing that I'd come across that was very interesting to me was while she was in high school, at John Muir High School, halfway through that point, La Cañada Flint Ridge made their own high school and took a lot of the white students out of John Muir. And that was interesting for me to think about happening while she was there, also because throughout this project, JPL has become, part of it in terms of thinking about, what it means for rocket science within Pasadena to be sort of coming into fruition while she's just growing up, and because she writes so much about space exploration. But thinking about La Cañada Flint Ridge being on the other side of the Arroyo Seco, and what it means for something like that to happen while she was in school, I think was really important to me.
And interestingly, I did not attend John Muir, but American attended John Muir, so did Rodney King. Think about the people that are coming out of this particular geographical location and how important they are to history and the present. Another thing that happened at the same time is that people don't know there are a lot of places that were sundown towns, and the only people of color that were there were domestic workers or maids. So San Marino, La Cañada, Flint Ridge, Glendale, Arcadia, parts of Monrovia. So these spaces that it's not just that the high school was created and the high school was built and so other people could go there. Even after this, Pasadena schools were not desegregated until September 1st, 1970, and has more private schools per capita than any other city in the nation of its size. So this is the thing that she's experiencing. By this time, she is out of high school, but she still is thinking that she wants to be a paid writer, like writing is going to be her profession. She says that she had never read another word by a Black person that was written. She didn't see it in her daily life, but that she still aspired to do that. She says it's because she didn't have any sense in the vernacular.
Well,
she didn't know any better. She was hard-headed, right?
Maybe that's what made it like possible in a way, was she wasn't doing it because she saw someone do it. She did it because she just wanted to, or she saw that needed to happen. But I'm curious if you could say anything about the Octavia Butler archive and maybe how it came to be.
So I started the Octavia E Butler Legacy Network in 2011 during my doctoral research. My whole dissertation is written on Octavia Butler's life and work. So this is 2011. She passed away in 2006. A press release said in 2009 that the papers were going there, but I was already working on my dissertation. So people ask me, like, well, why didn't it end up at the Schomburg in New York, in Harlem? Why did she give her papers there? And the fact is, someone from there asked her. She went to do a women's studies talk when she already lived in Seattle, so she flew back here, and she was asked by a woman named Sue Hodson if she would be willing to will her papers there. So she took her on the tour, and she showed her, all the things in the background. And eventually, Octavia Butler put it in her will and informed Sue sort of after the fact. And that's how it happened. But in terms of like JPL and Caltech, Ironically, the Huntington uses the Athenaeum to house people when they do conferences, so it's connected to Caltech. She had an inkling that if the apocalypse hit, her things would be safe. They're literally in an underground vault. Someone has to bring them up in a, from underground in a climate-controlled facility.
I don't think they could be more safe. But I think it's so fraught to think about that because it's, this such wealthy, white area. Like that's kind of what it takes for it to be protected that way. And that's so frustrating, I think. But as you mentioned, like thinking about her mom, like cleaning houses, like not that far away from there because that's who would have owned those houses. But I also just wanted to quickly mention, like also on the Huntington premises, it's a botanical garden. So also thinking about all these desert plants that she writes about in the parable are also sort of, cascading this landscape that's surrounding where her papers are, which I think is like so interesting.
Well, it's even more like deep than that. So it's not just the botanical gardens and the research library. It's like Downton Abbey there. The big house is there, essentially. The Huntington mansion where Arabella and Henry Huntington lived is there. It's these two people, and they had a staff of 15. I want to know about the staff. There's no record of the staff there. My mother, who was born in 1954, who's the same age as Ruby Bridges, right? She says when they went that they were not allowed inside the galleries. They let the black kids from Compton only see the gardens. They were not allowed inside. And when we had the exhibit there, there's this huge picture, like this big, of Octavia Butler. And, her best friend and other black folks from the neighborhood were coming and like pausing, and they were like, we made it, like we're accepted here. Because people have tried to throw me out while I was teaching there, like, oh, you can't be here. And it was a sundown town, and people have tried to throw me out and said, like, excuse me, ma'am, what can I help you? Like asking if this black woman belongs there. But ironically, this space, like Octavia Butler brings the most black, the most queer, the most women, the most working class researchers from around the globe to look at her papers, which consist of more than 10,000 individual items and over 350 boxes of materials and ephemera that she collected over her lifetime. So it's a huge, huge deal that her papers are there and that she makes a space for people like us to do work where you can go there for a day of research and not see another person of color unless they're a guard or a person on the housekeeping staff.
Or they're also looking at her papers.
Right. Yeah. Like Moya Bailey and I were some of the first people to go in and look, but for a while I had such anxiety being there and such survivor's guilt that I would talk to every person of color that was in there and ask them what they were doing. I was like, no, Ayana, sit down and do your own work. But I was like, if something goes down, I want to know who's there, because it's not a space that's been welcoming to women and people of color, gender nonconforming queer folks. Like, it hasn't been a space that welcomes regular folks. And so she has really changed the institution and pushed the institution forward just by virtue of her being who she was and what she wrote.
I want to ask you to speculate on this, but maybe you actually know, like, where the city of Robledo would exist. Because my understanding is, like, it's somewhere kind of near Altadena, Pasadena, and I think a lot of the description of it reminds me of that, and I'm curious if you have an idea.
I think there is a document in the archives, some notes that were never published that talk about like the actual street names. So I think it would be Northwest Pasadena. So like, west of Lake, north of Washington, in this very specific space, like probably where you're riding your bike or going to camp, like the space, like literally.
West of Lake.
I think.
Okay.
I mean, it's a cul-de-sac, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of cul-de-sacs there.
But it's a working, it's a working class Pasadena neighborhood. But of course, Pasadena appears and Altadena appears in Kindred, Speech Sounds. The place where the Patternist series has Pasadena in it. So it's all of those places are all Robledo. All those fictional landscapes, she describes them in different places. And going back to the Huntington and the plants, so there was someone who worked for Huntington who was developing, it was a working ranch. It was its own city. And then eventually Huntington sold off parcels of his real estate and railroad money, like land, to make the city of San Marino. But there was a person who was a eugenicist, and Curtis Mares, who teaches at UC San Diego, has written about how they would be like, oh, let's get all the black crew to work on these gardens over here, and they would get paid a certain amount, and let's have the Asian people work here, these laborers, and let's have like Mexican American or Mexican workers work here. So when you're at the Huntington, like the legacy of all of these things are literally embedded in the landscape. In one of the orientation galleries, there's like a map, like a cross-section of how it looked in this year and how it looks now. And you'll see, workers' quarters. And this is when I almost got thrown out. I was like pointing out to my students, like, oh, here's where the people lived that worked on these gardens and these gardens. And the person was outraged that I was airing dirty laundry, essentially. It was a person who was a wealthy docent or volunteer who thought, like, who is this uppity woman talking about things that we don't want to talk about? But it's not untrue. So I think a lot of the times Octavia Butler was really telling the truth about what she was witnessing. So like Robledo it's Pasadena, but her street is this working class regular street.
And also, with the other books you mentioned, she does like really design the city based off of the streets. And there was one document you showed me, and I think Natalie Russell showed me as well, where I think it was for Forsyth.
And that's from the Patternist series.
Yeah,
yes.
Where she writes this map with the fictional street names, and they're sort of laid onto the actual street names of Altadena, Pasadena.
I think her imagination was really haunted by the space that sort of gets dismissed. There are actually houses in Altadena, Pasadena in like Back to the Future. A part of that was filmed near there. And the legislation for Prop 187 comes out of like a city government official who keeps proposing it in the legislature over and over again. So like there's something to be said for like seeing things at the local level and extrapolating how they impact people all over the globe.
And I think also in her writing, I think something that people that haven't read a lot or haven't read any sort of like don't really understand like how actually dark a lot of it is. And I think, and also sort of tough and like the circumstances that the characters are navigating are very like isolating and alienating and oftentimes painful. And I think that's something that is very much, it is wanting to air the dirty laundry of like, this is sort of how, if I'm sort of putting a mirror up to society, this is what's going on. But I think in a lot of how she sort of characterized like popularly, I think a lot of that sort of gets left out.
I think so too. People want to be like, this is fiction.
Yeah.
Like, oh, it's imaginary. Oh, this is futuristic. Oh, Afrofuturism. But it's really based on, remembering. There's an Oprah magazine article that she wrote after her mother passed away about living on the premises, like living plantation style in the house as an abject individual, meaning Octavia Butler was, remember, who knows whose grandparents said like children should be seen and not heard, right? So she writes about recognizing this dog, and she sort of projects into the story like Dick and Jane and their dog Spot. Here's mom and dad. But these are her everyday experiences of growing up until maybe first or second grade, not having their own home. Her grandmother was a cook, her mother was a maid, maybe one of her uncles was a gardener, another uncle was maybe the driver. Like this is the life that she was living and experiencing. But people sort of skip right over that to like, oh, genius, award, nebula. But one of the things Auntie Gail said is that basically she remembered that Octavia would wear like plaid and stripes. Like she wasn't fashionable. She didn't have a lot of money for clothing. And sometimes people, she said, this person doesn't want to be my friend anymore because I dress badly and they're ashamed of me and there's nothing I can do about how I dress. So I'm going to be here alone. I wish this person would call me or write me a letter. Like this deep sense of loneliness. People knew that she was poor and that her mother cleaned houses. And they looked down on her, even among the other working class folks that were in the neighborhood. And we're sort of airing dirty laundry because she's like a hometown hero now, right? But she was really relentlessly bullied and treated very poorly by lots of folks, especially early on, given that she was very shy and about 6 feet tall by the time she was 12 years old. America didn't believe me when I recounted this fact, but it's the truth.
You mentioned that she often gets sort of put in this category of Afrofuturist, and you had brought up this term, was it histofuturist? Yes.
So in 1981, way before Mark Derry is interviewing Samuel Delaney, Tricia Rose, and someone else, and comes up with the term Afrofuturism, Butler has already named her own orientation. And I think part of what we are engaged in is sort of a histofuturism, right? I think Afrofuturism has become this sort of blanket term. I don't know, I think it's very useful for people to understand looking at Black joy and Black imagination as a source of inspiration. But it's very one-sided, I think. And she called herself a histofuturist. She distinguished between futurists who are looking at the shiny machine and all of the supposed human innovation that, you know, erasing racism and sexism and classism and poverty without actually fixing it. Then she said historians are victors. They're writing from the perspective of the person who won, and they're often maligning whole groups of people, their religious beliefs, their customs. So she comes up with this term, histofuturist. And I think that really speaks to the reparative work that we're doing by showing up in spaces that we traditionally have not been allowed, or our parents were not allowed, but just accepted that that's the way that things were. So I really hope you should look at Shelley Streeby's work. She teaches at UCSD. She's written a book about climate change and talks about Butler's use of histofuturists and this history of looking at like Reagan being president and all of the things that were happening, this winnable nuclear war. Like, we are right on over here with the war in Ukraine, saying we're going to defend Taiwan, and like we're on the cusp of World War III, but this is the Cold War, and the space race really went hand in hand. So the innovation, the shiny machine sort of was like, you know, I think we should just say this out loud. If you went to school here, you have earthquake drills. But do you remember having like
nuclear drills?
Yeah, do you remember those?
That was after me, or before me. I mean,
you cannot tell because I moisturize, but I'm older. But they used to tell us like the mythology was that Ronald Reagan would go on the podium and say like, okay, if the Russians shoot a nuke at us, we are going to send up this shield called Star Wars that's going to go up over our country. There were like graphics and cartoons that showed the shield going over the United States. And that we were trained to get under our desks and hold on to the leg of the desk. My 11-year-old is like, if a nuclear bomb comes, you're not going to survive that. But he's living in a world where he knows that that's the truth, but we're ignorant. We don't know. We watched the Challenger explode on live television. They showed it to us when we were in first or second grade or whatever. So we were so hopeful about how we were being taught to be futurists while ignoring all of the things at the ground level. So I want to say to all of you, you and your experiences are also part of history. The people that you know, the people who are everyday people, are also holding knowledge and history. So please talk to them. Like, don't wait for someone to come to the exhibit. Like, don't wait to interview someone.
So, no, I love that you say that, because this term histofuturist, when I heard it, made me think of historical materialism, and I've been sort of like describing this project as sort of a historical materialist ode to Octavia Butler, and using that term to sort of think about how these different social factors or conditions, like thinking about Octavia Butler only being possible because of, you know, the Great Migration, Second Great Migration, you know, so sort of all of this activity that's going on, people fleeing from, you know, racial terrorism in the South, people looking for job opportunities and ultimately ending up in Los Angeles. Even though that's a broad phenomenon, you know, she could only exist because of that. And I think that all of that is evident in her work and how she is writing about what's going to happen in the future. And so thinking of, yeah, historical conditions, who was where and why, what kind of work were they doing, who were they having kids with, all of these things are what sort of, you know, are producing this, I don't know, reality that she's making.
So I think you're doing similar work. It's like you're mapping the history of the future, right? So we've drawn on these archives all the way back to, what's the earliest thing that you have in the show?
I don't know, in the show, the earliest thing I found in the archive was like 1933 or something.
So these are things that her mother had as a teenager, basically, that she saved. So talking about materialism, like physical objects, also print out your digital photographs. Don't rely on social media and corporate curation in order to map out who you are. Have a physical photo album that can burn up in a fire because the internet and the cloud might not be there, right? Octavia Butler did not write her first book on a computer until 1997. Everything else was written on a typewriter or by hand. And once she started learning WordPerfect and Microsoft Word, she would print out her daily things that she typed on the computer and save it because some of her stuff would get deleted or missing. So, you know, I'm thinking about analog girl in a digital world. Become analog. Rely on the material things. Many Black folks have nothing to pass on because we simply did not have any material things or property to pass on to our folks. So I think the fact that she kept so many objects that we could go back and see and kept some things that belonged to her mother, I think there are some things in the archive that are around 1930 or earlier. Mm-hmm. But Natalie Russell, who they mentioned earlier, was the person who took more than 3.5 years to catalog all of these 10,000 items. So she was reading Parable of the Sower and whatever books, but some of the things she didn't understand what she was looking at when she was arranging them. So there are things where it says like, oh, it's Octavia Butler's handwriting, but it's actually her mother's handwriting, which I can identify. So there may be some earlier things in there. Mm. So there's something to be said for asking yourself, well, what are the walls that you need to dismantle, tear down before someone comes in and knocks it down for you and changes your life? Like, you know, what internal walls do we have? I mean, I said to American, that gate looks like almost every gate of every apartment building I ever lived in as a child. I mean, identical wrought iron, like they probably came from the same place. The cinder block that dorm rooms are painted over, like the industrialization of our neighborhoods and green spaces that were orchards and grapevines. There's something to be said for JPL polluting the Arroyo with early rocket tests.
And Parable in the Sower begins in 2024. It's so soon, so it's only natural that, you know, we can expect a lot of what we would have visualized in that scenario will look the same as it does now. Oh. So I think, you know, thinking about what Robledo could look like Robledo would already be here, you know, and that's also something I thought about with the film, because because the film, it's made by the Robledo Historical Society, but it sort of takes place in the past, and I sort of was imagining for Robledo to be in the state that it's in 2024, it had to be there for a while, you know, so what was it like before? And maybe there was a time when it was affluent enough that they had a historical society that could make a documentary. So that's kind of, yeah, where that was beginning. And so, you know, Robledo in that state where it's gated, every single little community has its own gate. That would have been, you know, within the context of how we see Altadena and Pasadena now. So you can sort of just imagine a wall around each of these little communities, because everyone's sort of anticipating being, their territory being sacked and everything being stolen and then being driven out, you know.
Well, think about the process we just went on during the pandemic, in terms of, you know, students leaving the public school, their parents wanting to form their own pods, like school in your living room. Like, this was extremely traumatic for me as an educator and a parent to witness this. Like, I've read all of this, like school in your living room. So the things that were unfolding in the parables, I feel like they happened a little bit earlier.
Right.
Also, the fires, though, too. We had the entire mountainside just burning, burning, burning. Some of the hugest fires to date have occurred within this last however many month period since February or March 2020. So, I mean, the apocalypse has already happened for somebody somewhere. I think that's her point.
Yeah.
I think we have to keep saying that. I think some of your other work that I've only seen photographs of, like these little, and I don't think it's little, but these small acts of, I'm not finding the right word, but foreclosure or making someone's world smaller or limiting their experience. I feel like you are continually reporting on the history of the future, and it's the unvoiced or unexpressed, the things that have not been discussed come up in your work. We're still tearing down the walls of COVID. I feel like there's still all of these barriers. I mean, we have still barriers to gun control. We had at least the assault weapons ban, right, that expired. We had the first Gulf War. We've had a second Gulf War. Like, all of these things, some things unfolded like right after she wrote about them. And she would be like, well, I tried to
tell them.
I tried to mention it.
I think you described it well in terms of thinking of the apocalypse, if you want to call it that, as something ongoing that has always been going on, and different people experience it in different times, in different ways, you know, differentially, because of different privilege and proximity. And so not thinking of it as a sort of singular, spectacular moment. And I agree that that's something that she was trying to convey. I think we're gonna turn it to a Q&A. So yeah, Adam's gonna join us.
We're gonna end on a high note.
Yeah.
Apocalypse is everywhere. So we're going to take some questions from you in the audience, and so that we can pick up your question on the audio, you're going to have to sort of shout it out, and then Adam will. I was just doing your job. Adam will then rephrase your question and then pose it to us.
Yeah, pretty much. It's a little hard to see, so maybe let's start right here. Okay, so the question more or less is, where did Octavia Butler's insight come from? Was it from the process of writing and from books, or was she anointed by some sort of other force?
That's a great question because, yeah, part of this project has been about thinking of, I think, the frequency of Black creative, I don't know, scientific people in the area. And so I do think there is something special about Octavia Butler. Yeah, I think she had this desire to become who she was going to become before she was, you know, reading a lot of history or anything. I think it was already there. As far as like how she was able to predict things, I think she was just paying attention, you know?
I agree with what you said. I think having seen more of the archives than almost any other person besides the archivist, there are multiple things happening. She was not Christian, so the idea of being anointed, she might reject herself, but she called herself a news junkie. And one of the things that you see in the archives is that, like, let's say something was published in the LA Times that was about oil drilling in Alaska or something. She would argue back with the text. She would literally write in the margins, like, I don't know what you think is going to happen when XYZ disaster, da 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 da. And she would be like, oh, Dr. So-and-so? Then she would go to the library and she would look up their books and she would look in journal articles. Like, this is analog. Again, I'm old enough to remember the wooden card catalog drawer that you pull out and you take the card out and then you take the number, write it on your slip of paper, then you go to the library and look it up on the Dewey Decimal System. So again, analog research. This was not Wikipedia and Google and JSTOR. Like, this was actual hours and hours of research. So she said, like, you know, this law happened, this disaster happened, this endangered species, these slime molds. And she was really a person who was very, very learned and self-taught and did meticulous research. In terms of anointing and in terms of having some special quality about her, she recognized her neurodivergence. And also she was an only child. She told herself stories from the age of 4 onward. And when she got old enough, she started writing them down. And her mother loved her so dearly that she, you know, humored her when she said, like, oh, I want a typewriter. And she spent lots of money buying her a typewriter. Even though her aunties were like, girl, Negroes can't be writers. So in terms of having this, what she called positive obsession, this inborn and innate purpose of being driven toward who you are and growing into your name. Remember they called her Junie at home as a child, maybe like Octavia Jr. Her birthday's also in June. They called her Estella at school and among peers, but then her writing is Octavia Estelle Butler. So she could feel she was growing toward wholeness, I think, psychologically, and used her writing to heal some of the very painful cultural wounds that she was tapped into. That's what I think as a depth psychologist. So you can call it a form of purpose or something like anointing, but I do think it's not in a religious or spiritual sense, but maybe in an intellectual, psychological sense that is about collective healing and the human beings and the planet and all the organisms surviving their adolescence. I think that's part of what she was driven by.
Down here, please. Yes.
Do you know if it's now definite that there will be a TV series based on Kindred?
So the question is it true or a rumor that Kindred will become a television show?
Yes, the pilot for Kindred has already been completed by FX, and I believe they're wrapping up filming the season, the limited series. There's a young Black woman TV exec that facilitated the acquisition of the rights for screen, and all of her works have been optioned at one time or another. But Juvia Productions, which belongs to Viola Davis, is also working on Wild Seed, which is being co-written by Nnedi Okorafor, a Nigerian writer. So I think it will not just be Kindred, it'll be Wild Seed, and I think Dawn has also been optioned. That will come in the works. The episodes for Wild Seed have already been written, and they're going through the editing process, as far as I understand. Did we?
Oh, sorry, can't see.
Hi. So, I was wondering if possible for you to speak a little bit about this issue around Afrofuturity or Afrofuturism as opposed to Histofuturism, because I think that so much of her work is about, and I think one of you said it, imagining us in places that we're not supposed to be, which I think has to do with Black futurity. So possibly making some kind of distinction between like Black futurity, Afrofuturism, which I think is different, and Histofuturism.
Yeah, so let me just reiterate for posterity. So the question is to suss out a little more the distinctions between the sort of rubric or narrative of Astrofuturism as a genre and Butler's own expression of her own form of writing, Historo-Futurist.
I mean, I personally, like, I teach Black Futurism or Black Futurist thought or Black Futurist inquiry for non-Black folks, right? Afrofuturism became more popular in 2018 with Black Panther, although Black Panther is a fantasy, right, and a comic book movie, but many things that are being called Afrofuturism are actually not futurist, and also much of her work, like, does not take place in the future, and so I think the label doesn't really necessarily fit, but that is what people, like academics use that word, and that word is popular, people understand it, but they don't maybe understand what the fundamentals are of Black futurist thought, which is what they're pointing to. I don't know.
People use it as a blanket term, and you also use the term Black futurity, which I think people use Afrofuturism as a blanket statement for anything that's Black and speculative and futuristic, and that's not what it is. It's a pretty specific like movement and moment in arts and music, and not that, you know, people aren't able to continue that legacy or trajectory of Afrofuturism, but it does come out of a very specific sort of movement with certain aesthetic symbolism and cues and visual language. And I think it's sort of used to encompass everything, but I think Histofuturism is obviously something that Butler used to describe herself. So I don't know other examples of what that would look like, but I think in my own work, I also sort of move away from the term Afrofuturism because I do feel like it's limited, and I also want to sort of respect what it is and where it began, and not sort of trying to use that to describe everything that any Black person does that happens speculatively or in the future. And I also think part of Afrofuturism is about, you know, using things like space travel or space exploration in a sort of fantastical way to think about, you know, being in a place where we're not oppressed, or we sort of can make our own rules. And I personally, and I think Butler also is more interested in sort of seeing the ways in which this notion of futurity or speculation occurs in mundane life, or sort of real, you know, I don't know, the legal tactics of a politician, or the way that poverty, you know, expresses itself, like architecturally or something like that, which is, you know, a little less spectacular. And I feel like that's sort of where she's trying to go with the Histofuturism.
And remember, like, histofuturist is a term that no one would have known about without the archives. It's not something she ever publicly wrote about. You just see it in practice. So that's something, again, you can look at things that Shelley Strebe has written, talking about that term and situating it in our timeline and how Butler developed that notion. But I would say there's this very simple concept of there are Black people in the future, because very often in horror films and in all kinds of work, either there are no people of color who have lines, or they're just, this is what Butler found. She has an essay called 5 Rules for Predicting the Future. That was probably in Essence or somewhere. If you all ever hear me refer to something and you hit me up, I will send you a link or a PDF, like, so you can be educated on these things. But, you know, it may be helpful for some people, but not everything. Afrofuturism is also very US centric, and there's so much fabulation and exploration happening outside of the African American diasporic experience. We have Nnedi Okorafor's work, which she calls African Jujuism and African Futurism, which is based on actual lived experience and beliefs and ways of being as an African person in African culture, like, which is very different than, you know, wearing goggles and having, you know, space exploration. On the other hand, she watched Star Trek from the time when it originally aired, and she thought Uhura looked like a space secretary. She thought Lando Calrissian was the Judas in the Star Wars film. She went back and watched it multiple times, but she wasn't like, oh, we're there, we've made it. She was like, this is not it. This is not all there is. These are not the only possibilities. And remember the mammy image, like we had Gone with the Wind, which romanticized this, you know, caretaking and subservience. She is saying none of these things and limited things are good enough for any of us to aspire to as the only thing we can aspire to. And I have to say, Auntie Gail was a teacher in Pasadena Unified School District. That was a good job. Lots of black folks had good jobs with pensions, but these were the things. My grandmother was a nurse. These are the things that they were told was making it, right? Like, I have a PhD, right? You know, like, this is not something that my grandmother thought that she was ever going to experience for herself. But she survived so that I could experience it. Just like your father, your parents survived through the things that they experienced. Like, our parents lived during Jim Crow. This is not like it happened to somebody else. Like, this is like 2 little old ladies who make it to 80 years old. So I think Octavia was very much clued into that reality of every day. You can look at a PBS special called there's something on the Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto, and I think American would agree. American would agree with that more, but some people are outraged when they see that. But you asked a question, so we'll come back to you.
Yeah, we got room maybe for about 2 more. So this gentleman over here.
I'm wondering, as a continuation of the parable of the sower and the talents, and just your own experience with looking at the archive of Octavia, if you could talk a little bit or speculate on where the parable of the trickster might have
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. Okay, so there's 2 novels that were published, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. And there was a 3rd novel, I believe, in process, which I think Octavia put down for various reasons. And one of the questions is why and what might that 3rd book have been?
Did you look at that stuff?
I did. Well, I looked at the article you sent me, was about Jerry Canavan, which was really amazing because, basically he has looked at the archive extensively and sort of tried to think about where Trickster would have gone. And it was basically thinking, there's a spoiler alert, I'm sorry, but basically thinking of this colony that would have gone on into space and what it would have looked like. There's even like a map of how it, would have been shaped. And basically he speculates on how she's thinking this colony would have sort of like, I guess, folded or met its end, and thinking about how patriarchy being one of the things that would have ultimately not, would have still been maintained in this new society and would have, created these dynamics, which like humanity has this sort of innate, ability to reproduce all of the hierarchical, awful power dynamics that it always has. And ultimately that's what, leads to the end of this. Well, I don't know if that's the end of the book, but that's.
Well, she stopped and started writing that. There are like dozens and dozens of possible iterations. One of the things that happens is that Butler couldn't see how she could write about humans colonizing somewhere else because she knew how messed up that was. Her conscience would not allow her to do that without consequence, and one of the consequences and part of the drafts were that the planet itself is an organism and it is rejecting them and causing them to go blind and have hallucinations and all kinds of terrible life-threatening things that take place. But seeing the drafts of Parable of the Trickster, because you know what's coming and when the end of her life is, reading her journals, knowing like she's complaining about the side effects of medications that she was taking, when she finally got health insurance, you know that she's not gonna finish it. So you just, eating up every morsel and feeling like you yourself are abandoned on this planet without Lauren Olamina. Like this is how it feels to us now. So it was a very difficult thing. She had lots of writer's block and she eventually abandoned it and wrote Fledgling. So I think you should read Fledgling as the salve.
Please.
I have a question about the shape of research, since so much of her books were influenced by her own life experience. Was curious to know in the archive, beyond just manuscripts and documents, what type of objects there were. Because so much of the things that you're describing are from like an embodied experience of a landscape or a context, but how do you encapsulate that in an archive?
So this is a research and methodological question. Most of the exhibition is predicated on lived experience and interpreting the landscape in which people lived and do live today and will live in the future. How do you sort of get that out of the archive, which tends to be, objects, documents, manuscripts, and so on and so forth. So basically, how do you make them speak? Maybe what do they preclude? And what other objects besides what we normally think are in archives that informed your research and ultimate project?
Yeah, I think what struck me from the archive was a lot of the older things from like her childhood or being in school, like her notes from school. Like one of the things in the show is these notes that she took in history class about Pasadena, and it's like a list of facts about Pasadena. But then she also has like this map of Star Island, this like fictional island that she came up with when she was young, and she also has like a button pin from John Muir High School, and there's all these sort of like personal things that I think would not necessarily become part of many academic archives, but it very much feels like that all is pertinent to what we see in all of her work. So I feel like that is why it's there, and also I don't know, she wanted it to be there.
I think also, if you remember what I said at the beginning, her mother came in the year 1930. And for any of us who have any relatives who were alive during the Depression, or who were poor, cash poor, in an economically under-resourced position, you don't throw away things because you don't know if you're gonna have the money to replace it. So I think that's part of why she kept some of the things. But there are the everyday objects. There's this little tiny, like maybe this big, like some kind of miniature composition book that her mother was writing down whose house she was cleaning and what dates and how she had to collect the money that she obviously carried in her pocket. And there are like regular everyday things like notebook paper and spiral-bound Mead notebooks that you would have carried to school that she would buy for 50 cents or whatever. There were, when she got the money to buy her own books instead of the library, she would take the labels off the back of the book at Borders, and she stuck them all on a page, like as a way of keeping a record of the books that she had purchased. So I want to say the 10,000 plus items that are in the archive are not everything. I hope that they're working on getting her more than 10,000 books from her personal library. deposited there. All of Jack London's books are there, and I don't want to see those.
That's a bit different.
There's a really brilliant Jack London researcher writing some biographical work. There's some overlaps of philosophy between these California writers, but there are all kinds of things that you wouldn't think you would save. Like there's like a piece of toilet paper, like a one-ply toilet paper that has notes on it. Things that belonged to her grandmother and mother, like receipts from making a car payment on behalf of one of the uncles in, you know, the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
So when I started, like when I made my first request, I tried to find the oldest thing in there, and what came back was this pedigree chart for a chinchilla from like 1930s, and then like a book about turtles, like a kid's book, and yeah. And I was like, I guess I need to look somewhere else. But yeah, I think seeing these sort of like everyday objects alongside the things that, yeah, if it's like one note that I think could have been important, but it seems like, you know, something maybe would have thrown away, but she didn't throw it away because obviously it factored into what she was doing.
I mean, there are like the cast-off items that her mother's employers threw away that had some good use out of them still. So stained, ripped, water damaged, things that she repurposed. Like we get manuals in PDF, but they used to come in a 3-ring binder. So like your dishwasher, or no, sorry, refrigerator, your radio used to come in a 3-ring binder. So those binders, those are things that Butler saved. So it's not just papers, it's also what they call ephemera and also commonplace books, which are things that you can buy at the drugstore to use, but they have value because they belong to her. And I think, again, I'll say to you, think about what it means to be a person in this timeline. What are the grand narratives that will be told about this future, in the future? What story have you documented? Who are the people around you that you can ask? Like Auntie Gail and her book club. Like that for me, they said like, oh, can we pay you to come and talk to our book club? And I was like, absolutely not. I'm the one who's getting the richest from just sitting at your feet. And so who are those people? What are those opportunities? I mean, coming here is great. We're in an institution, but what are the relationship and everyday, like people that you can touch, who you can draw wisdom and inspiration from? That's the question I have for you.
And I hope we embodied that to some degree tonight. So I want to thank you very much for joining us, for sharing your stories and your thoughts, as well as yours. And thank you.
Thank you.